It was a cold fall night when Max, a paranormal investigator, received a call that would change his life forever. The voice on the other end of the phone was shaky and anxious. "Max, I need your help. Something unusual is happening in the old cemetery in town." "I've seen things I can't explain," said Emily, a childhood friend of Max. Without wasting any time, Max got dressed and headed towards the cemetery. The full moon illuminated the path, but the atmosphere was charged with a strange tension. When he arrived at the cemetery, he found Emily waiting for him near the entrance. "Emily, what have you seen here?" Max asked, worried. She told him about his experiences, fleeting apparitions, whispering voices, and a feeling of being constantly watched. Max nodded seriously and took out his paranormal investigation equipment, cameras, audio recorders, and electromagnetic field meters. Together, they began exploring the cemetery for evidence of paranormal activity. For hours, they found nothing out of the ordinary. Max began to wonder if this was all just a figment of Emily's imagination, but just as he was about to leave, something strange happened. A dense fog began to surround them, enveloping them completely. Max and Emily looked at each other in horror as the fog grew thicker and more oppressive. Suddenly, they heard chilling laughter that seemed to come from everywhere. The temperature dropped sharply, and their breaths turned into small clouds of steam. Max turned on his flashlight and swept the light across the area. It was then that he saw the shadows moving between the tombstones. Dark, ghostly figures danced around them, laughing sinisterly. Emily trembled in fear, unable to move. "Let's get out of here," Max yelled, grabbing Emily's arm. They ran towards the entrance, but the fog seemed to have no end. The shadows followed them closely, incomprehensible whispers filled the air. Finally, after an eternity, they walked out of the cemetery and the fog immediately disappeared. Max and Emily gasped, exhausted and terrified by what they had witnessed. They decided to return to Emily's house to review the recordings and photos they had taken during the experience. Reviewing the audio recordings, they were perplexed to hear whispering voices that they had not noticed at the time. The voices seemed to speak words in an ancient and unknown language. Max also noticed that shadows and blurry figures appeared in several photos that were not present when the images were taken. Days later, Max decided to investigate the history of the cemetery. He discovered that the site had been founded in the 19th century and that it housed graves of people who had lived difficult and, in some cases, tragic lives. He also found an old diary of a gravedigger that mentioned rumors about dark rituals that had been carried out in the cemetery in the past. Convinced that there was more than just paranormal activity at play, Max decided to return to the cemetery one more night. This time, he brought with him an ancient book of spells and protections that he had acquired in his previous research. When they arrived at the cemetery, Max and Emily made a protective circle around them, following the instructions in the book. As they did so, the fog began to form again, but this time it seemed reluctant to approach the circle. Max began to recite an ancient purification spell, throwing salt and burning aromatic herbs. Emily held a lit candle, the bright, warm light from it offsetting the darkness of the fog. As the spell continued, the shadows and laughter gradually faded away. The air became calmer as Max's spell continued to take effect. The shadows slowly retreated, receding toward the graves and disappearing into the darkness of the night. Emily held the candle firmly, its warm light becoming a beacon of hope in the midst of uncertainty. Finally, the fog vanished completely, and the cemetery fell silent. Max and Emily looked at each other, exhausted but relieved. They had cleared the darkness that hung over the ancient graveyard and restored peace, at least for the moment. With the evidence gathered and the experience they had gone through, Max was convinced that something darker was at play in the cemetery. They decided to return to Emily's house to analyze the audio recordings and photos they had taken during her last visit. Playing back the recordings, Max noticed that the whispering voices became clearer as the spell progressed. He heard words in an ancient language that he had not encountered in any of his previous research. The voices seemed to be talking about an ancient ritual and a mysterious object hidden in the cemetery. The photos revealed shadows and figures that appeared to be surrounding a particular grave. Max and Emily decided to return to the cemetery later in the day to investigate further. They would search for the grave mentioned in the recordings and any clues that would lead them to the object the voices were talking about. The next day, in the sunlight, the cemetery looked completely different. The tombs looked less threatening, and the shadows had completely disappeared. Max and Emily began to meticulously explore the place, stopping at the grave that had been mentioned. The grave was covered in moss and almost illegible, but Max managed to decipher the name, Isabella Blackwood. As they cleaned the tombstone, they noticed that there was a symbol carved into the bottom, a symbol that Max recognized from his research into dark rituals. They decided to open the tomb carefully, fearing what they might find. As they did so, they revealed a small ancient wooden chest. The chest was locked with an ornate lock, and on its top was engraved the same symbol they had found in the tomb. Max took a lockpick from his backpack and skillfully opened the lock. Lifting the lid of the chest, they were surprised by what they found inside, an ancient leather-bound book, written in a language neither of them could understand. As Max flipped through the pages, Emily noticed whispering voices talking about this book. It appeared to be an ancient grimoire, filled with dark spells and forbidden rituals. The voices on the recordings had referred to it as the Book of Shadows. Max and Emily carefully took the book and brought it back to Emily's house, where they began researching its contents in hopes of understanding its meaning. As they translated the pages, they discovered that the book contained spells to summon and control spirits, as well as rituals to gain supernatural powers. They realized that the cemetery had been disturbed by someone who had used this book for dark purposes. The shadows and apparitions they had witnessed were the result of those rituals. The decision was clear: they had to return the book to the place where they had found it and perform a ritual to seal it again. Max knew that the book must not fall into the wrong hands and that its power must remain hidden. Armed with their knowledge of the book and their experience at the cemetery, Max and Emily returned to the cemetery once more. In the place where they had found the chest, they performed the sealing ritual, invoking protective forces and asking that the book remain inaccessible forever. As they finished the ritual, a sense of peace filled the cemetery. The fog did not appear again, and the shadows disappeared completely. They had restored tranquility to the ancient cemetery and ensured that the dark secret that lay underground remained hidden. The story of the secret of the cemetery became a warning about the importance of respecting sacred places and not seeking dark powers. Max and Emily continued their search for the paranormal, but this experience reminded them that sometimes curiosity can unleash forces beyond our understanding and control. The old cemetery, once again, became a quiet resting place for those who had departed, and its secret was buried beneath the earth, where it belonged.